Hello, everybody. We're about to get started, and I'll just ask if people who aren't seated, if you want to find a seat, just to find a seat, and if I think we've got enough seats, but we can bring others in. I'm so thrilled to see the amount of people that have shown up. It's really, really cold out, and it's like, yeah, so I grew up here, and I still just don't like days like today. But anyway, although it is quite beautiful, I have to say. So I'm Caroline Tate. I'm a professor in the Department of Psychiatry, and I'm a medical anthropologist, and I am a Métis from McDowell, Saskatchewan, along the river road between St. Louis and McDowell. If any of you have ever been along that road, it's beautiful, and it's a beautiful place to have grown up by the Saskatchewan River. And so I'm very pleased to also be the principal investigator of the Indigenous Mentorship Network. And many of our mentors are in the room today, our faculty, and we have students in the room. And we have our wonderful coordinator, Alison Pichet, who is really responsible, along with our co-sponsors, in setting up this event. And so this event is primarily for students, because we're the mentorship network. So I'm very happy to see the students here. And before I introduce Dr. Tallbear, what I want to say to the students is that we thought about mentors across the country. And when we thought about mentorship and mentors, we decided to bring Dr. Tallbear here because I don't think you could find a better mentor and a stronger scholar in this country and in North America and internationally, I would say. So she is talked about a lot. She's incredibly relevant for the conversations we are having, both here in Saskatchewan and in Canada and internationally. And so when you're thinking about who you want to be and where you want to be, and the values and the passion that you would like to have in your life and in your work to make it meaningful, I think there can be probably no other better mentor than Dr. Tallbear. So Dr. Tallbear comes from us from the University of Alberta in the department, or the Faculty of Indigenous Studies. And many of you, I think, know her work, and if you've been to NASA, you definitely know her work. And so I'm going to turn it over to her now to give us a talk, and she's going to introduce herself a little bit more, but I want you to clap really, really loud for the fact that she came here on such a cold, cold day and is with us, and we're just so very pleased to have you here. So thank you.
Thank you. Allison, what's the time frame? I forgot to ask you. 45, and then how long do we have for Q&A? Okay, so we have to be done by 1, or I mean, 12:31. Okay, it's 11:40 here, right? Okay, so we have to be done by. Okay. Okay, all right. So I will try to keep track of myself because I do like Q&A. Thank you for that really nice introduction. I really appreciate that. And it's just as cold in Edmonton pretty much, so. So I am going to introduce myself a little bit since this is students that this is for, just to give you a sense of where I come from. I'm enrolled Sisseton-Wahpeton Oyate, which is a Dakota tribe, we use that word in the US, in the northeastern part of South Dakota, but I grew up on another Dakota reservation, the Flanders Santee Sioux Reservation, which is about 2 hours south of there in the southeastern corner of South Dakota. I was born in Pipestone, Minnesota, which is where the quarries are, where a lot of the stone comes for ceremonial pipe, and that's also Dakota people keeping those quarries going, although there's no recognized tribal community there. But everybody between those locations is pretty much related, and we're related to, of course, all of the Dakota people in what is today Minnesota. And our homeland, historic homelands, my four-greats-grandfather, his village was about where the Minnesota Science Museum is in downtown St. Paul. So of course they took all the best land, right, and then pushed us out. So I went between those reservations and rural communities growing up, and the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. My mom left our reservation when I was 8 and moved to Minneapolis to be a grant writer for Little Earth, which was the first American Indian low-income housing project in the country. And then went on to be the main grant writer for Red Schoolhouse, which was founded by Eddie Betten-Benet, who's, I guess, I don't know if Eddie's in Canada or in, is he? Or, yeah. So I'm not accustomed to this rural-urban divide that people talk about, because for me, I was raised in a landscape in which our migratory routes were just in our historic homelands, but some of that happened to be settled by rural farmers, and some of it happened to be settled by people that then became urbanites and built cities. So for me, it's not a divide. It's our historic homelands, and we still move through those spaces. So that's kind of really important in shaping, I think, my approach to how I inhabit what we call Indian country in the US. And I was very formatively shaped not only by cultural leaders and tribal government leaders and artists and activists at home, because I was born in 1968. My mom had 4 kids by the time she was 24. She was an undergraduate at Northern State College in Aberdeen, South Dakota. So the American Indian movement was kind of raging around us at that time. And so I grew up with student activists and artists and singer-songwriters coming in and out of our house, but also was influenced by tribal government leaders. So again, I didn't see that divide between tribal government and activism. And I didn't see the divide between people doing planning, science, technology, and arts either. So I'm really grateful for that growing up, and I guess I've only in the last 10 years come to realize that not everybody was so fortunate to have a childhood and a growing up that was so marked by, frankly, a lack of boundaries and more a sort of sense of migrating through space. So I have to be really grateful for that. So that's where I come from, and I think it really helped lay the work for, or the path for where I came to today. And just one last thing, my mom taught me early on how to make kin. And so everywhere I go, I make kin out of people. And so my mentors, when I moved out of South Dakota and went to school out east in Massachusetts, they were no longer tribal government leaders and indigenous artists, activists, and thinkers, but they were other people of color, feminists, people within these urban communities in the East Coast, and then later on the West Coast, who I also take a lot from. And you'll see those influences in what I'm going to talk about today. Okay, so I have some notes, although this talk is really partly off the top of my head as well, and I'm going to put my old lady glasses on because I'm 50 now, and suddenly I can't see anymore. So I want to start by telling a quick story that'll give you a sense of what I have had to put up with as I've worked with so many scientists and engineers. I am a social scientist, I'm an anthropologist of science, and I'm trained as a community and environmental planner. I am not a geneticist. I study geneticists because they give us a lot of trouble. So I was at the American Society for Human Genetics back in 2010, and that was a really important year. I think that was the year that Rod McInnes, who is at McGill, who's a CRC Tier 1 at McGill, was president of ASHG, and the meeting was in Washington, D.C. So it's mostly a lot of Americans, Europeans, people from all over the world. And Rod McInnes gave a really important talk that year where he basically said that geneticists need to come into he called it the metaphorical tent of indigenous people, but I call it the ontological tent, that they need to come inhabit our worldview. This was like some big radical thing at ASHG that year, because US-based scientists, well, I mean, they most scientists, but especially there in relationship to indigenous issues, tend to occupy this worldview in which there's science and then there's culture, and they think they don't have culture in politics. So at that same meeting, which I had advised Rod McInnes, I was one of the people that advised him on his talk, I was on a bioethics panel, and there were 4 of us bioethicists and people who study race or indigeneity in relationship to genetics, and it was a pretty big room. I'd say it was seating about 300 people. And at the end of our panel, this older white woman geneticist, which she would have been a trailblazer in her day, being a geneticist, and she's in like her 70s. Would have been a big deal when she was young. She stood up and she was so angry, she was shaking. And she said to me, she was talking to me, she said, "How dare you impose politics on our field? Please." So this is going to tell you how politics already inhabits all of these fields. So I'm often accused of imposing politics onto science, but as most of you, I hope all of you in this room know, science and technology is already intimately tied up with political projects. And I'm going to give you some examples today. But most foundationally, we have to understand that science and technology come out of colonial and very political traditions that assume that indigenous people are supposed to be on the receiving end of the gaze. Right there, that is an incredibly acute political statement. We're here to look at you. We're here to study you. We're here to figure out what's wrong with you, which is exactly why I study geneticists, because I want to find out what's wrong with them, because we're fine. So, one of the things that I started doing, though, as I was studying geneticists and looking at the way they gaze upon our bodies, our bones, into our blood, down to the molecular level, is I also simultaneously really began to notice and study indigenous resistance to colonial science, because that's also always been going on. And also because I'm a planner, and my mom was a community planner and was an institution builder both on the reservation and in the city, I've always really, before I could read, been cognizant of and interested in Native people's efforts to transform and govern our communities, including through science and technology. Because nation states govern through science and technology, so do we. So that's kind of the broad background. So here's some of those examples of how science is always already political. So I have this talk organized according to 4 different roles for Indigenous people in relationship to science and technology as objects of research. Academics might call us subjects, but really it's more like an object. And then we'll move through the roles of collaborator, scientist, and then governance. So first, starting with the research object. In the 19th and 20th century, in race and colonial science, it's actually commonly thought, I think, that racial science has ended, particularly around the early 20th century and definitely after World War II and what happened in Nazi Germany. We often also hear racial science mischaracterized as pseudoscience. I want you to think very carefully when you use that word pseudoscience about whether you're really talking about pseudoscience or whether you're talking about science that has subsequently been proven wrong but was in its day considered good and rigorous science. And that's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about pseudoscience. We're talking about science that was at the cutting edge, practiced in the most prestigious institutions. So distinguished scientists then practicing cutting edge science. So for example, Nazi Germany, that's a Nazi scientist in the middle. Nazi Germany took foundational lessons from the US and Britain. Here on the left, you see a textbook with the hierarchy of man. That was the label given to that visual. I'm sorry, it's a bit small. Where you see the Greek skull at the pinnacle, I guess representing white people. And you see the Negro, that's the terminology they used in 1868, sitting down just above the non-human primate. There is another book by Joseph Beeder, I think published in 1986, called Science Encounters the Indian or something, where you see the Indian would have been between the Negro and the Greek skull. Because at the time, this is this hierarchy of man, when Europeans encountered Native people in the Americas, as their science was evolving in the 19th century, they viewed this hierarchy of evolution. So there were the savages on the bottom, which were signified by the Negro who had stopped evolving. This was their knowledge at the time. Then they viewed indigenous people as barbarians, so our evolution was halted when the superior white man came over here. And then they, of course, were the fully evolved civilized people. So again, this is cutting edge science. This is being practiced at places like Harvard and Columbia and Oxford. This is not pseudoscience. So this is kind of the cultural and evolutionary theory at the time. So this is what's going on in the 19th century. There's a whole lot of history of science. If you're interested in that, it's a fantastic field and it's an important field. As an anthropologist of science, I rely a lot on historians who are digging through these archives and looking at, in fine detail, what was going on in people's thinking back then. So let's fast forward then to 2017, thinking about that. And Canadian conservative columnist Conrad Black, I didn't know who this guy was till I came up here, wrote in the National Post in 2017 that Canadian society is under attack when John A. Macdonald is vilified, and I'm going to quote, The natives arrived here approximately 20,000 or more years before the Europeans did, but their civilization in the 16th century was at least 5,000 years behind that of Europe by any reasonable measurement of the maturity of a culture or economy of a society. And the natives were not sufficiently numerous or attached to durable places of residence to be said to occupy the territory of what is now Canada. So you can recognize these kinds of rationalizations, right? These rationalizations informed by old school evolutionary theory that's not as old school as we think it is, that are used to inform political decisions today. So the ideas of non-whites having lesser evolved cultures and that justifying European and American extraction of resources are not simply the rantings of extreme racists. They are ideas that have long histories in European and Euro-American society. And I would challenge you to look for those in the kinds of popular discourse you see around rights to resource extraction. What kinds of underlying evolutionary analogies are being used to justify that? So we went from 1868 to 2017. Now let's rewind back to 1939 in that central picture. Here you have a German scientist measuring a Tibetan woman's cranium. That same scientist would go on to advise Nazi doctors on race science. He was a physical anthropologist. That was what was known as the American School of Anthropology. That field was built on the study of indigenous peoples' bones and later on blood. So going from 1939 past World War II, in the mid-20th century, and many of you will already know about this case on the bottom right, but my US audiences don't tend to know. Experiments were conducted on First Nations people in Manitoba and in 6 residential schools across Canada. Indigenous people, some of them almost starved, were used as a living laboratory for nutrition scientists to pursue research questions about which they were curious, and we need to be careful about examining the kinds of research questions that get asked. Who is asking them from out of which kinds of life stories and experiences? Now, you heard my life story. And if you follow my work, you can begin to see how the questions that I ask are coming out of that life story of being raised by a Dakota mother, a Dakota grandmother, and a Korean Métis great-grandmother who married into a Dakota family. That's who I was raised by. That informs the kinds of questions that I ask. Everybody's questions are informed by where they come from. So here were the research questions that were being asked by these scientists when they were studying these hungry First Nations people. Number 1, and these are quotes from Ian Mosby's article, was the, quote, shiftless, indolent, inert Indian really simply a malnourished subject? Number 2, were foods supplied by traders inadequate in light of modern nutritional knowledge? Well, why was food being supplied by traders? Because indigenous people were torn from their traditional lands by settlers who were hell-bent on imposing their ways of life on them and disrupting their relationships with their relations. And some of our relations we eat, right? So indigenous people had their lifeways cut from beneath their feet in a very short period of time. One can imagine how one becomes malnourished in a situation like that. But their question is, are they malnourished because they don't have modern nutritional knowledge? Hilarious. Deadly hilarious. So the research questions are never, of course, about the irredeemable damage on our bodies and communities of colonial policies. Rather, research questions coming out of these universities, these settler institutions, often assume a colonial baseline, that settlers have a right to occupy land, and that more colonial intervention, science and technology, can fix the resulting problems. Scientific research on indigenous people usually also assumes indigenous deviance from supposed European biological and cultural norms. So our bodies and cultures get measured in relationship to their normativity. But it's not political at all. So, is it better in the 21st century? Yes and no. So here I'm just going to talk and try not to go over too much over time. Okay. So this first visual on the left, and this really resonates right now. Who's been following the Elizabeth Warren case? I know that's like a US thing. Aussie, not as much as I just gave a talk in New York last month, and they were all over that. So Elizabeth Warren, senator from Massachusetts, has been claiming she's Cherokee since, I don't know when, probably since she was a kid. But it comes out in the news in 2012 when she was running for Senate. Scott Brown, her Republican opponent, challenged her, and that's when they were calling her Pocahontas. There were a bunch of investigative reporters in Boston found out that when she went to Penn and then Harvard, she began claiming, or they claimed that she was Native American, quote unquote. She was hired as a quote unquote woman of color. Cherokee genealogists did her genealogy. There's no Cherokee or Delaware ancestry. That's what she's claiming. The Cherokee are the object of, I would say, 90% of the pretendianism in the United States. As I lived in the South, I worked at University of Texas, I would go through the South, drive up to Virginia where my daughter lives, and I would constantly run into people who would say they were part Cherokee. This is like so common. So Elizabeth Warren is not alone, right? She's one of probably hundreds of thousands of people who do this. So she gets called Pocahontas again, I think last year by Cheeto, and so people are blaming it on Trump, but really this has been a problem for a while. This is not just a Trump-era thing. But she releases her DNA test, right? Did anybody see the video in here? I should have had that clip in here. She released about a 5-minute video back in October, releasing the results of her DNA test, which were, I guess the DNA test was done through 23andMe's technology, but it was actually analyzed by Carlos Bustamante, who's a geneticist at Stanford, who does most of his sampling and genetic work in 3 Latin American countries. I can't remember which ones, but anyway, he compared her DNA markers to samples in his data set from Latin American countries. They released this very slickly produced 5-minute video back in October where she's sitting around with her white family in Norman, Oklahoma, talking about being Cherokee. Indigenous Cherokee, actually Cherokee people, real Cherokee people have pointed out to me that it's so interesting because her 3 white brothers and her are sitting in this living room and they're all drinking a can of beer on camera, like probably actual Cherokee people wouldn't want to be sitting on camera with a can of beer because they know they bear the brunt of those stereotypes. So anyway, this has all been in the news, so this is why I bring this up. So I've probably done 50 media interviews since October on Elizabeth Warren, because back in 2013, I published a book, Native American DNA, Tribal Belonging and the False Promise of Genetic Science, and part of what I looked at in that book was this company, Orchid Cellmark, on the left. They say the truth is in the DNA. With an Orchid DNA test, discerning Native American lineage for tribal enrollment is, I can't read it all, is a fact. Fast, simple, and non-invasive. Yeah, they see I'm getting so old here. Orchid provides irrefutable results through scientific assessment of alleged biological relationships. So really what Orchid Cellmark was doing, so this is interesting, this is a very different type of DNA technology than Elizabeth Warren used. This is just a paternity test. That's what tribes in the US use, and I think some First Nations in Canada do this too. If you can't get enrolled or citizenship, because usually it's paternity that's in question, right? You'll go do a parentage test and say, okay, yeah, that really is the bio dad. We can therefore invoke his documentation. That's not what she used. But what's really interesting is whether it's a DNA paternity test or whether it's the genetic ancestry that's looking at ancient ancestry in the Americas that Warren used, it's the same kind of visuals, the same kind of discourse. It doesn't matter what the technology is. The idea is that the truth of who you are is in the DNA. Human DNA, which is undercutting co-constitutive relations between indigenous peoples and their other human relations, but also their non-human relations. What it is to be indigenous is a lot more complicated, or what it is to be Dakota is a lot more complicated than a DNA test. And Warren was asserting what I had, I can't go into this in a lot of detail today, but what I outline in my book is a very kind of settler way of thinking about kinship. That you can tell who you are and who your kin are solely by looking at the molecules in your body. And that's really undercutting a much more complicated set of relations that we tend to focus on, both politically and I think materially, when we're thinking about how we're related to our local landscapes and homelands and our non-human relatives. So I have a whole chapter looking at companies like Orchid Cellmark. And so you've got, the other thing that's really interesting is a lot of these companies will use this very stereotypical imagery, always of Native American men. That's really interesting too. So there's a gendered thing going on here, which I didn't pay close enough attention to. But look at him, he's like looking into the sunset with his flute, right? It reminds me of that 1970s blanket or poster we used to see. I know most of you weren't around then, but in the 1970s at powwows, you'd see these blankets and posters with the end of the trail, right? The poor, sad Indian humped over on his horse, you know, like his civilization is dying and he's going into the sunset. And of course it was all disease and cultural backwardness. It wasn't genocide or anything like that. So this is like the 21st century version of that being taken up by DNA testing companies. It's just incredible, but there's no politics in DNA. They'll blame it on the marketers, though. When I bring this up to them, they don't realize these discourses inhabit the way they sample, too. So there's that. And you probably can't tell, but I had a white anthropologist friend who does not want to be named, who photoshopped Elizabeth Warren's face onto Columbia. Can you see? So that's why I call it American Progress Redux instead of just American Progress. So yeah, I'm going to use that for something. I haven't decided yet. But so not much has changed, right? You've got this white woman carrying this book of knowledge, which somebody, Cole Thrush, who's a historian at UBC, told me what that book was, because he actually knows more about the details of the painting than me. I think it's a English language textbook or something from the 19th century. So she's bringing language and enlightenment and knowledge. So look how she's coming out of the east, and it's light, and it's dark in the west. The Indians are at the foreground being chased into the darkness. The buffalo are being chased away. Here comes the farmers with their plows, the covered wagon, the trains. All of this knowledge and enlightenment and technology is moving from the east to the west, bringing light. There's not much difference in the way that science and technology are talked about today. Really, there's not a lot of difference. And who are they pushing out of the way in their quest to enlighten us all, right? I'm going to get to what's good about science, but you have to read the texts of what they're doing. I really don't fundamentally think a lot has changed. Conceptually, nothing really has changed. So Warren is just like, if you follow Democratic Party politics, she's going to be our savior, the hope, the light, and the way, right? To save us from President Trump. Okay, so then on the bottom right here, you have another geneticist, Spencer Wells. He's probably one of the most famous celebrity geneticists from the Genographic Project. I also write a whole chapter about this in my book. So this is another kind of cultural, evolutionary, hierarchical narrative that continues to inhabit the way that genetic science gets done, which is why I have this quote from him. Ideally, he's looking for indigenous people, or in countries where indigenous doesn't work as a label, they're looking for traditional peoples, because it doesn't work everywhere. In much of Africa and Asia, indigenous is a contested term, and so geneticists will use other terms. But when they're looking for people to bleed, they say ideally they, indigenous people, would be living in the same place as their ancestors did centuries ago. Well, that's nice when it happens, but there's a little thing called relocation and genocide. They should have been relatively isolated from immigration from surrounding groups who have moved into the region recently. Did the colonizer allow that? They also should retain some of their ancestors' ways of life, be it language, marriage patterns, or other cultural attributes. In other words, what we want are indigenous people. There's a strong denial here that genocide happened. When they go into a community and they actually look for people to sample, they're often looking for people with 3 or 4 grandparents who come from that tribe. Well, those of us who are indigenous know pre and post contact, our peoples moved around, we intermarried, we traded, we had kinship networks. Who's isolated? When were they ever isolated? But there's this idea, it's funny, geneticists need to talk more to historians because they would realize how really bad their history is quite often. So they're still going around, many of them, doing this kind of work. And a lot of the questions that they ask, which is why Elizabeth Warren could purchase a DNA test in the first place, have to do with wanting to look back and have a window into that ancient, unadulterated ancestry. They call it being non-admixed, because their research questions are really focused on purity. They're focused on human migrations, on kinds of ancient populations. And it's not that those aren't interesting research questions, but what about the work that some of my more critical geneticist friends are doing, which is saying, you know, what I'm really interested in is how the genome of indigenous peoples today is reflecting settler colonial violence. That's what I'm interested in. I'm not interested in purity and non-admixture. I want to look at intergenerational trauma and how that's reflected in the genome. That's a question that indigenous and non-indigenous geneticists are asking from a much more critical and kind of historically informed point of view. So we can still do science, but let's figure out what kind of questions we want to ask and on whose back we're doing that work and to whose benefit we're doing that work. So that was the kind of bad story. Now I want to move into K-1201. I want to talk about working with indigenous peoples as collaborators, because that's kind of the next step that happens in the academy. Once people figure out they don't want to do things the old bad colonial way, they start talking about collaboration. And that's a good move. But I want to focus on for me, one of the more interesting collaborations that I've kind of theorized around the edges of. I actually wasn't centrally involved in this. My father's daughter was the tribal environmental director for this tribe at the time. This tribe is, the Pinoleville Pomo Nation is in Ukiah, California, which is the county seat of Mendocino County, 2 hours north of Berkeley. And I was working at Berkeley in the College of Natural Resources when this project was going on. So I'll show a video in a second, but I just want to fill you in before you watch the video. Hopefully it'll work. This project was initiated both by I don't like to call him my ex-husband, that's part of my other sexualities work, because he's still family, so he's my co-parent and my best friend. It was initiated by him in concert with some of the tribal leadership there and Professor Alice Agagino, who is a self-described feminist engineer. Now, feminist engineers and scientists, the ones I work with, are not largely working with women. That's not what their feminism is necessarily about. Their feminism is about critiquing the same kinds of hierarchies in knowledge production that Indigenous people, queer folks, Crip people have been critiquing, right? A lot of us who have been the object of the scientific gaze, whose bodies and cultures are seen as deviant, whose social lives are seen as deviant, have been subjected to the same kinds of kind of oppressive discourses. And so Alice Agagino is really clear about having a diverse lab. This is her lab of undergraduates and graduates on the right. She is somebody who's deeply involved in something called co-design. I've got colleagues at University of Alberta working on co-design processes. So she approached Pinoleville Pomo Nation. They wanted green, sustainable housing. They talked about how to do that, co-designing with the community from the ground up, children, elders, even the tribal employees, not all of whom were tribal members, because they were considered a part of the community and part of who should be producing knowledge on the part of the community. So they went in, and it was really important that she had a diverse team. So this young man over on the left, Ryan Shelby, who now has his PhD, Ryan wrote his PhD in civil engineering around the building of this house. Ryan is the grandson of sharecroppers from rural Alabama. And so he's not somebody who's supposed to be at Berkeley either. And he ended up working really closely with Pinoleville. And this little boy up here, you'll see this in the video in a minute, Kanalu. Kanalu is Nathan's son, who also worked in the environmental program. Kanalu and Ryan got pretty close. And it was really important for those young kids at Pinoleville to see this really diverse, gender diverse and racially diverse set of young engineers and architects, because Berkeley's a world away, even though it's only 2 hours. These kids do not think they're going to be able to go to Berkeley. So I want to show the video.
Sustainability projects get dreamed up in our courses.
We are at the greenhouse of the Pinoleville Pomo Nation, and we're working on building the culturally sensitive, sustainable home that was developed as part of these EBS classes. I use what's called a human-centered design technique, and that means we make the humans the center focal point of any of the building of the design, and then the technology follows. And in that kind of process, we look at all the different legs of sustainability: economic sustainability, environmental sustainability, and then social sustainability. And it turns out on this project, social sustainability was really important.
Back in 2007, I took a class with Professor Alice Agagino. It was called Sustainable Product Development. And in this class, we brought together engineers, architects, sociologists, and also some business majors. And our goal is to really come up with how can we actually create an idea that you could actually turn into a real organization or a real business. How do you actually help people improve their current level of sustainability? These local communities wanted to be able to partner with other organizations to, one, not only quantify their current level of sustainability, but actually start designing and implementing these solutions.
The students came in and did not pose as experts right away, and that allowed the tribe to assert its kind of cultural principles, its ideas about technology, its ideas about social life.
I'm very excited about seeing this project done. I come up here every day and look at it and just think, wow, you know, looking at the hay bales and thinking about the insulation and trying to think of how could, in the future, could we get a little bit greener? You know, I don't know, you know, but it's exciting.
It's a tribe that believes that sustainability is key to their long-term survivability in this country. What do they actually mean by sustainability? Or when they said they wanted energy and water efficient buildings, well, what does that actually mean? Going through this co-design process, we've been able to realize that when they talk about sustainability, it's not just about greenhouse gas emissions, or it's not just about, let's say, embedded water. It's around these concepts of tribal sovereignty, concepts of economic self-sufficiency and environmental harmony.
You know, being a Native American person, I was raised with a close awareness to the Mother Earth and of our effect. And living here, I've always wanted to be a little more gentler in the way that we live, you know. This project, you know, the house being a straw bale, passive solar and the water catchment, gray water systems fits right into a dream that I've always had. It's really important to me that we have a say in the things that we build for our future. We just had a blessing ceremony yesterday. It was the first time my wife and my kids had seen anything. I remember I told my wife, this would be it's obviously a great opportunity for us to get a little closer to nature. And her first response was, well, how close are we gonna get?
We realized early on that one of their criteria for what sustainable housing would be, it means that it has to include usage of natural materials. And we realized that straw bale and also tule was material that they use in some of their traditional homes. So they really want to incorporate a lot of that into these new homes that they're building now. The goal is to show that these homes actually will have at least a 30% savings on electricity usage and roughly a 25% savings on water usage. And the plan is to take this model and then use it to build an additional 2 homes. And if those homes work well, and if we still are saving those energy and water consumption reduction, the plan is to take those designs and expand out to build an additional 23 new homes.
They call Ryan, Uncle Ryan, my kids. My kid wants to be an engineer. Kinala, the one that's here with me today, they played Legos together.
They have a young kid aspiring to go to Berkeley to be an engineer. That's a big thing, and the collaboration has had a lot to do with that. I think Pinoleville feels very much like it's kind of on a cutting edge, and that is another change from when reservations were dumping grounds. And now this place is building a reputation for trying new things and advancing the thinking on the way tribal people do things.
So I just wanted to say 3 other things about that project. They really focused, because this was a Berkeley kind of PR video that the engineering school uses, so they really talk more about the environmental sustainability, but the cultural or social sustainability stuff was equally important in the actual conversations on the ground. And one of the things that they did through the co-design process is they figured out, even though it looks pretty square from the outside, they have a lot of rounded corners on the inside of the house. Of course, that messed with the kind of cost of building the structure to have rounded corners, but spirits hide in square corners, and so they didn't want as many square corners. They also wanted a different configuration of rooms because they didn't want, and we have the same problem with housing and urban development houses in Indian country in the US, they didn't want all these small bedrooms. They wanted more big social room, bigger open spaces between the kitchen and the living room, and they also needed maybe smaller bedrooms and then areas to store the tule, the stuff that they make canoes and baskets and things out of, and to store their regalia. So they needed a really kind of different kind of house, and then also one that accommodated extended family. When the architects from Berkeley first came in, and they were these like really highfalutin, sophisticated, urbane architects, they were really thinking about the way that green building gets conceived of through the US green building standards, which are really urban-centric. And they came in thinking about mixed-use housing, and you've got these big families with trucks and stuff they're weaving stuff with. They're like, yeah, I don't want to live above a store in some little 2-bedroom apartment, right? So they really, the architects and the engineers were very challenged by the lifeways, and they learned how very cultural their own quote-unquote environmental sustainability standards were, that they didn't see were configured through a particular kind of cultural lens. So moving on to the next role. So we've thought about Indigenous peoples as being objects of the scientific gaze. Then we've really, many of us in the Academy, moved into that previous role of working with Indigenous community as collaborators. We're also moving heavily into this 3rd role of training Indigenous peoples as scientists, because I think we're going to get better to asking those questions that serve our communities more if we actually train more of our own scientists and engineers. So, and one of the other things I've kind of discovered in working with Indigenous scientists and critical scientists is that it's really a chicken and egg problem, having more diversity in science, because having more diversity generates more diversity. So some of the Navajo geneticists I've talked to, for example, said, well, what really helped me stay in science was not my white male PI, who was good and taught me some of the rules of the game, but what really made me not feel culturally alienated was when I had that South Asian feminist woman PI, or when I went to SOCNIS, the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos and Native Americans in Science, and I talked to other Indigenous and Latinx people about how to stay in science and how to balance sort of my attachment to home and culture and my ceremonial schedule with balancing the kinds of schedules of the academy, right? So it's hard, though, to diversify science without an already diverse scientific workforce, and that's kind of one of the things that we're running into. So I do want to talk a little bit about our summer internship for Indigenous Peoples in Genomics, which is, we started in the US in 2011. We have native and non-native geneticists, increasingly more Indigenous geneticists as we bring them up through the ranks, and bioethicists who do this week-long summer training program. We expanded to New Zealand, I think 2 years ago at the University of Waikato, and then we started in Canada last summer. We were at Simon Fraser. We did a clam and conservation genomic themed summer internship. This summer, we're going to do chronic wasting disease and look at the genomic aspects of that in Alberta, which has a chronic wasting disease zone. One of the things I've discovered in moving from the US to Canada and starting Sing Canada, they're really focused on human genome issues in the US, and that's great. We are really just naturally moving towards focusing on non-human genome stuff and the relationships between humans and non-humans. So I'm thinking, our summer program is going to be a little bit more kind of land-based. That's eventually what it'll evolve into. And we want to have a different theme sing across every province and territory in Canada and then in the coming, dozen years. So next year we're thinking we're probably going to be working with people at Concordia and McGill on something related to intergenerational trauma and epigenetics. I would like to come to Saskatchewan and work on something that's a little bit politically controversial, so I'll talk about that with people as I go. But we basically have traditional students coming in who they can already be science students, but the science students, what they get is they get to come into a lab where it's kind of Indigenous worldview centered. That's really important for them. The non-science students come in and they get that, but they also get a little bit accustomed to the culture of the lab, and they figure out if they want to try to do what they need to do to be in the sciences. And then we get community members, and we're going to have more community members in Canada, I think, than what they have in the US, who have to think about governing science and dealing with science collaborations and things from back home on the reserve or wherever they are, or if they're in an urban community, and they get more indoctrinated into the culture of science as well. So that's a lot of what happens at that summer program. And then this visual is just from I don't have time to talk too much about it, but we are, as we get a more diverse scientific workforce, we are kind of trying to change things within these fields as well. This is from the American Physical Anthropology Symposium. So the physical anthropologists were like that Nazi science guy, right? Like that's the founding of their field. In 2017, we were in New Orleans for the national meeting, and we had this How Academic Diversity is Transforming Scientific Knowledge two-part panel. So these are some of the titles these are biological anthropologists, these are not social scientists, these are genetic scientists, anthropological geneticists, writing papers like Undisciplining Desire, Bisexual and Queer Approaches to Science, or Dead-End Evolutionary Lineage, Says the White Man, The Evolution of Homo erectus and Homo sapiens in Asia. So students, graduate students, bringing in queer theory, race theory, indigenous theory into the way that they're doing their science. I was one of the old people commentators, and it was really interesting. They gave us a room that sat 250, and I walked in there, and I'm like, it's not gonna be big enough. And we had people on the floors, out in the hallway. There's a time, right? And they coined a new hashtag science tears, because there were so many people crying in the room. It was cute. So it wasn't like white tears in a bad way. It was science tears in a good way. So that's one of the things that I've been involved in. Again, I'm not a scientist, but I do a lot of work to help mentor wherever I can young scientists, indigenous scientists, scientists of color, and queer scientists. So I'm going to move on quickly to the governance role. Allison, where are you? Let's see. So when am I supposed to start Q&A? We have to be totally done with everything by 12:30, right? Oh, we have till what time? Okay. But I will try to be quicker. So I want to move on to governance now and you can see how these things are all interrelated. So this is a picture of, on the bottom left, from Central Coast, California, around where Santa Cruz is. That's where I did my PhD. And it's Ohlone people, or this is the Amamutsan band. They do not have federal recognition. So they're not a tribe that has that status, but they do have quite a lot of recognition within Indigenous people in California and by the state. So they do inhabit those sets of intergovernmental relations. And what they have found is actually not having federal recognition has in some ways worked to their benefits, because in the US, of course, the states and federally recognized tribes are always in a very contentious relationship, because when a tribe has federal recognition, its lands are taken out of the state tax base. And states, of course, don't realize that tribes have they should realize it, but they don't, that tribes have a federal government, a government-to-government relationship according to which they kind of are in direct dialogue with the federal government about things like environmental regulations, different kinds of, and tribes set their own regulations. Often states will try to set environmental regs that are weaker than what a tribal government would set. So you can imagine the kinds of arguments that arise. So with Amamutsan, what they've done is they've actually developed a pretty good relationship with the state of California Department of Environmental Quality. Of course, California has pretty strict environmental standards. And one of the things they've done is they are working on fire management. Now they've got these terrible wildfires that are happening in Central Coast California. So Amamutsan Band, along with scientists from the state and local knowledge holders, so there are local non-native people who have also been landholders there for several hundred years, who also have knowledge about that landscape. And they've taken this kind of very multidisciplinary, multicultural approach to fire management. So this is one example of using science and technology integrated with indigenous knowledge to do good governance. And I just want to say one thing. I don't have time to go into a lot of detail, but I don't use the term traditional knowledge very much. And when I talk about indigenous knowledge, I mean any knowledge that we use to survive as collectivities. So that can be whatever kinds of knowledge we want to use. It can be quote unquote traditional cultural knowledge. It can be scientific knowledge. Because again, I come from a community where we had medicine people and planners and, you know, artists and activists all alongside each other approaching a problem as members of that community and using whatever theoretical tools or knowledge tools that they needed to solve that particular problem. So if it's indigenous people doing it for our survival as a collectivity, to me that's indigenous knowledge. So I think this is really interesting, and I don't necessarily want to make a demarcation between what's traditional and what's not in relationship to the kinds of knowledges that we produce and use. So I would call that good governance. On the right, I would call this bad governance. That's me like 15 years ago, and that fake DNA tribal identity card. This is when DNA testing companies are beginning to sell their DNA tests at national tribal meetings. They'd come to trade shows and they had all kinds of problems with the management of data. They didn't know anything about tribal histories, and they were, and tribes were, this is when they started to use DNA tests. I think there are smart ways to use DNA testing in tribal enrollment, and there's a lot of really bad ways to use it. And without our own scientists providing culturally informed advising, we can't use DNA in the ways we need to, and I don't know how much has changed since then because I've kind of stopped following the DNA testing companies, but at that time, the only science advising on these tests that tribal governments were getting were from the people selling them the test. That is not independent science advising, that is not adequate. So we don't only need our own scientists, we need science advisors. So I'm trying to think where I wanted to end up with this. Just give me a second. Let's see. Oh, so this is and this is informed by Indigenous Studies scholarship for me as well. I mean, it's not only informed by my life, but it's informed by more recent scholarship. One of the things I've been foregrounding in a lot of my work, both in Indigenous science and technology stuff and in the Indigenous sexuality stuff that I'm writing on, is that we need a new narrative. I'm really critical, as are a lot of people in Indigenous studies, of the narrative that I think tends to center a lot of our work. And it's often unspoken, and that's a narrative related to that cultural evolutionary theory. It's a narrative of US and Canadian exceptionalism. It's a narrative of settler state exceptionalism, and multiculturalism is part of that narrative of exceptionalism. But if we're going to speak against that, I think we need another guiding narrative to help us figure out how to relate well together here, because I don't think being good citizens and getting inclusion into the state is going to work. It's not working. It marginalizes too many people. So what do we replace that with? Well, I and a lot of other Indigenous studies scholars have been talking about being in good relation, or whatever other way you want to say that based out of different Indigenous cultural worldviews. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about. Instead of this notion of linear progress over time, because I don't believe in that anymore, I'm thinking about how do we have good relations in place? How do we stop hoping for that future point that never comes, in which we're all perfectly included in this good multicultural nation state? So at that physical anthropology meeting where I showed you that visual of the science tiers papers, that just happened to happen the weekend of April 22nd, 2017, when the March for Science happened across the US and around the world. And so it was really interesting to watch all these scientists pouring into the streets, finally getting cognizant of politics. But their funding so they were marching because their funding was being threatened, National Science Foundation budgets, and Trump administration is denying climate change. So they're totally willing to get political when it's their necks on the line, right? But it was great. I love having scientists in the street. But a lot of what was happening through that narrative was this idea of redeeming the nation state. And one of the things that I keep saying to people is, you know, I don't like this focus on Trump as our moment of crisis, because science and technology fields, we've already been in crisis before Trump, and science and technology fields have contributed mightily to the kinds of environmental damage that we are worried about. We know that, especially in these kind of resource extractive areas in Canada. And of course, Idle No More was founded in 2012 here in Saskatoon, in part challenging the Harper government in its assaults on environmental regulations. So I've often been asked, as I move between these kinds of activist and scientific worlds, how scientists can help. And that brings me back to nation building. The first thing I tell them is you need to recognize that science is central to nation building, and dreams of nation building and its extractive resource practices are actually at the heart of the damage done to the planet, not only to Indigenous peoples. So nation building is a problem. Okay, so how do we replace this? And this is where I get at what Cornel West was saying. And Dr. West is a really well-known African-American philosopher. He's a racial justice activist. And when Trump was elected, Dr. West was calling for these multiracial alliances, right, to combat poverty and xenophobia. He had been to Standing Rock during the water protectors' actions there. And so it's really interesting. He'd just been to Standing Rock. Trump gets elected. Cornel West comes in and is calling for these multiracial alliances, and he completely erased Indigenous people in this big, long kind of speech he gave. It was quoted in The Guardian. It's very interesting. We're continuously erased. When I think that Indigenous communities, because of the way that we conceive of ourselves as peoples in this sort of relationship with other than human relatives, have a lot to offer in terms of an alternative narrative. And that's kind of why I have this slide in here. I do a whole talk on this, so I don't have time to get too much into that, but I guess that's what I want to leave you with, is that as I'm critiquing science, I'm critiquing it as a tool of the nation state that is predicated on Indigenous disappearance. And how can we take some of those tools and ways of knowing and begin to relate better in practice? So how do we engage in good relations in ways that where we're not simultaneously doing state building? Now that could be a whole other book, right? Because there's on the ground kind of knowledge production, little s science, and there's big S science, which is very much reliant on the violent institutions of the nation state, like the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, all of that. But that's a whole other talk, and I can't go into that. So that's kind of, after I've been doing this work for these years, now I'm sort of thinking, oh, am I at this spot where I've actually come to a question that that I can't answer? Well, I can't answer it yet. So anyway, I'm gonna leave you with that so we have some time for Q&A, and thank you for your attention.